This is the Station for Negotiation podcast episode number 49. My name is Gene Killian. I've been a lawyer and professional negotiator for 40 years. Folks, today I want to take you back to the year 1914 in the late spring, early summer of that year in the beautiful ancient city of Sarajevo, which is in southeastern Europe in the mountains of Bosnia. And unfortunately, the peacefulness of that city is about to be shattered because a group of amateur assassins who are disaffected young Bosnian Serbs have entered the city with the intention of murdering the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Now, what is their beef with the Archduke? Well, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand is the heir to the throne of the Empire of Austria-Hungary. And Austria annexed and occupied Bosnia in the year 1908. And actually, the ostensible reason for the Archduke visiting Sarajevo in June of 1914 is that he was there to inspect the Austrian troops. But really what he was going there for is he wanted a vacation with his wife, Sophie. And actually, Sophie and the Archduke traveled quite a bit around Europe because they were treated better when they were not in Austria. Franz Ferdinand, or the Archduke, was not looked at favorably by the Austrian ruling family because Sophie was a commoner. He had married a commoner who they viewed as beneath his social station. So they constantly insulted her when the Archduke and Sophie were in Austria. When they were at official events, they would make Sophie march at the back of the procession away from her husband. They just treated them pretty poorly. So the Archduke and Sophie liked to travel, and so that was the real reason for this trip. Also, they were there to celebrate their wedding anniversary. So on the morning of June 28th, 1914, the Archduke and Sophie get up and they get into a car, a large motoring car that's open, an open-air car, and they take a ride over to Town Hall in Sarajevo where they're supposed to have tea, meet with the mayor, and there are supposed to be some speeches. On the ride over to Town Hall, one of these young assassins steps forward and throws a bomb at the poor Archduke's car. Fortunately, it misses the car, bounces into the street, and explodes where it injures several people. And the Archduke tells the driver to stop so that he can get out of the car and walk back and make sure everybody's okay. Which is, if you stop and think about it, kind of crazy. But he does that. He gets back in the car. They drive to Town Hall. When they get to Town Hall, the first thing he does is berate the mayor. Like, how could this possibly happen in your city? But they have their tea, and then they have the speeches, and then they're supposed to take a trip through the old section of Sarajevo to their next meeting. And the old section of Sarajevo has really, really narrow streets. So it's hard to get a car in there and turn the car around. But the Archduke says, I don't want to go to that next meeting. What I want to do is go visit the people who got injured in the hospital. And the staff, the local staff and officials try to dissuade him from that. They say it's going to be too dangerous. They've already taken a shot at you once. Let's not do that. But the Archduke says, ridiculous. Let's go. I'm going to the hospital. Problem is, nobody told the driver that there had been a change in destination. So the Archduke and Sophie get into the car and they clatter off to what they think is the hospital. They get to a crossroads where one turn leads into the old town, and the other turn would be the way to the hospital. And the driver, who didn't know that the route had been changed, makes the turn to go into the old town down the narrow roads. One of the officials in the motorcade jumps up and yells, "Stop, stop, we have to turn around to go to the hospital." So the driver of this car, the open car with the Archduke and his wife in it, stops the car. And this is an old clunker, and old by our standards, clunker, and he's got to actually turn the engine off, do some machinations and shift the gears to get the thing to back up. So he does that. And at that moment, a 19-year-old Bosnian Serb, who is one of the amateur assassins, cannot believe his dumb luck. The guy's name is Gavrilo Princip, and he's standing on a corner outside an inn And he figures this whole plot has failed because the bomb attempt failed. And the other assassins who were supposed to be involved in this apparently froze. They didn't do anything. But Gavrilo Princip is standing on this corner, and 5 feet away from him is a car standing still with the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie in it. So Princip reaches into his pocket, pulls out a pistol, and fires 2 shots. The first shot hits the Archduke in the neck and severs an artery. The second shot goes through the side of the car and hits Sophie in the stomach, also severing an artery. And sadly, the 2 of them bleed out and die. And that incident, that by pure dumb luck that Gavrilo Princip was standing on that corner and fired those 2 shots, sets off the most vicious war in human history at the time, and at least 15 million people die. How does this happen, you ask? Well, Austria, the Austrian government, had no love lost for Franz Ferdinand. Apparently, he was a difficult guy to get along with. But they do view this as an opportunity to clamp down on Bosnia and send in more troops because they want to punish what they've considered to be kind of a disobedient region that's within their realm. So Austria declares war against Serbia. Serbia being the neighboring country to Bosnia, which is where Gavrilo Princip and his friends came from. Serbia has a treaty with Russia, unfortunately, and under that treaty, Russia promises to help Serbia if Serbia gets involved in a war. So when Austria declares war on Serbia, Russia declares war on Austria. Now, Austria has a treaty with Germany, in which Germany has promised to help Austria in any future war. So when Russia declares war on Austria, Germany declares war on Russia, which has always been Germany's archenemy. When that happens, France, who has a treaty with Russia promising to help Russia in the event of any future war, declares war on Russia. And then the British, figuring, well, if the Germans take France, that's not going to be good for us because we're next. They declare war on Germany, and they send a large portion of their army, the British Expeditionary Force, into France. And away we go. And that's what leads to 4 years of really brutal mutilation of troops in Europe and civilians. Ironically, the ironic thing about this is that Gavrilo Princip, killed the wrong guy. The Archduke, Franz Ferdinand, was dead set against any war with Serbia or Russia. And he actually favored creating a relatively independent Serbian district within the Austrian Empire so that the Serbs could govern themselves, which is what Gavrilo Princip and his cohorts really wanted to have happen. So they shot the wrong guy. But based on all this bad luck and bad fortune, the First World War kicks off and turns into just a horrible, horrible 4 years. But the reasons for the war go beyond just this interweb of treaties in Europe. A lot of this war, when you read about it, is based on the assumption that war is the natural condition of mankind. And this goes back centuries, but you can read the writings of the Prussian general and military theorist, 19th century military theorist Karl von Clausewitz, where he says war is the continuation of politics by other means. And he has plenty of support for that within the upper echelons throughout Europe. In a book called Germany and the Next War, Prussian General Friedrich von Bernhardt in 1910 writes a book in which he says war is a biological necessity. It is the carrying out among humankind of the natural law upon which all the laws of nature rest, the law of the struggle for existence. Von Bernhardt writes that nations must progress or decay, and there can be no standing still, and that Germany must choose world power or downfall. And some of the chapters in his book are entitled The Right to Make War, the duty to make war, and world power or downfall. And there's a lot of people who buy into this. Interestingly, there's another book that comes out at the same time by a writer named Norman Angell called The Great Illusion, in which he argues that war is the dumbest thing ever imagined. He basically says that because of the financial and economic interdependence of nations, anybody who wins a war is going to suffer equally with the loser. So war is completely unprofitable, and no nation should be foolish enough to start one. By this time, around 1910, the book gets translated into 11 languages, and there's a whole cult based on the grand illusion that believes war is crazy. Unfortunately, the other side wins. And as we can see, when the First World War touches off, there are an awful lot of people in Europe who believe that war is the natural condition of mankind, which leads us to Barbara Tuchman's famous 1962 Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Guns of August, one of the best history books ever written. Highly recommend that you read this book. I mentioned it in the last podcast. And for our purposes in this discussion, I want to ask, what does The Guns of August teach us about negotiation? By the way, John F. Kennedy thought this was one of the most important books ever written, and he recommended it to all of his friends when it came out in 1962. So I just want to look at a few things. I mean, there's many lessons you can pull out of this book. The first, I would say, third of the book is really about the lead up to the breakout of war in August 1914 and the various negotiations and discussions that take place unsuccessfully in an effort to forestall war. And the rest of the book is really the chess match between the armies in Europe in the summer of 1914 to try to bring a quick end to the war and take over Europe. The first rule that I want to give you from this book is never wear red pants to war or to a negotiation. Let me repeat that. Never wear red pants to war or to a negotiation. Now, what in the world do I mean by that? Well, I want to read you a very short passage from the book. And when I do read it, you're going to hear the name Messimy and Michel. These are French officials, and they are dealing with mobilizing the French army for war. Let me read you briefly what Barbara Tuchman says about this. Messimy, having fervently stamped out Michel's heresy of the defensive, did his best as war minister to equip the army to fight a successful offensive, but was in his turn frustrated in his most cherished prospect, the need to reform the French army uniform. The British had adopted khaki after the Boer War, and the Germans were about to make the change from Prussian blue to field gray. But in 1912, French soldiers still wore the same blue coats, red kepi, that's the hat, and red trousers they had worn in 1830, when rifle fire carried only 200 paces, and when armies fighting at these close quarters had no need for concealment. Visiting the Balkan front in 1912, Messimy saw the advantages gained by the dull-colored Bulgarians and came home determined to make the French soldier less visible. His project to clothe the soldiers in gray-blue or gray-green raised a howl of protest. Army pride was as intransigent about giving up its red trousers as it was about adopting heavy guns. Army prestige was once again felt to be at stake. To clothe the French soldier in some muddy, inglorious color, declared the Army's champions, would be to realize the fondest hope of Dreyfusards and Freemasons. Dreyfusards. The Dreyfus affair was a famous affair in which a Jewish soldier was basically falsely accused of treason. Back to the book. To banish all that is colorful, all that gives the soldier his vivid aspect, wrote the Echo de Paris, is to go contrary to both French taste and military function. Messimy pointed out that the two might no longer be synonymous, but his opponents proved immovable. At a parliamentary hearing, a former war minister, Monsieur Etienne, spoke for France. Eliminate the red trousers, he cried. Never. Le pantalon rouge, c'est la France. That blind and imbecile attachment to the most visible of all colors, wrote Massimi afterwards, was to have cruel consequences. It certainly did, especially for the people wearing those red trousers, because they made an inviting target. You know, by 1914, these soldiers on the other side, and both sides, had rifled bullets that could carry great distances and were extremely accurate. So making yourself visible in the field like that was basically suicide, and the Germans took advantage of it. You know, it's funny. When I read this again, it kind of reminded me of the movie, the great movie Good Morning Vietnam with Robin Williams. And in that movie, Robin Williams does a riff on being the U.S. Army's fashion coordinator. I wonder if he got his idea from this book, but at one point he's imitating the fictional Army fashion coordinator and says, you know, the whole camouflage thing doesn't work for me. You go into the jungle and I can't see you. I say, make a statement. If you're going to fight, clash. But I wonder whether he got the idea from this. But anyway, so what does this teach us about negotiation? You have these soldiers in the field who are stubbornly wearing red pants and getting picked off in truckfuls by German snipers. Well, the first point for negotiation is don't be too obvious. Always have a little more than what you show. Now, I often preach the benefits of cooperative negotiation here. The Getting to Yes school, in which both sides explore their interests and they view negotiation as a cooperative problem-solving exercise. And cooperative negotiators, by nature, want to put all the facts on the table and sort through them with their negotiating partner. But you want to be careful about that, and I am a cooperative negotiator by instinct. I've often talked about the tit-for-tat theory of negotiation, where you start cooperatively, but if the other side makes an aggressive move, you make an immediate, proportionally aggressive move. And then if the other side goes back to being cooperative, well, you go back to being cooperative. But you have to be careful if you're a cooperative negotiator about sharing too much. Think about holding back key facts until you really need them. Now, I'm not saying mislead the other side by leaving out key facts. I'm saying if you have an important piece of information that might be useful in the negotiation, consider when you really have to disclose it. So, for example, let's say you have some information that your negotiating partner has engaged in questionable business practices in other deals, and you think that bit of information might be useful to you in your negotiation with him or her now. Why share that information right away? You may never have to share it. You might want to think about keeping that in your back pocket in case things get to a logjam, and then you can lay it out there and say, hey, you know, we're aware of this fact, which is damaging to your position. We want to help you, you know, move forward and not have this information disclosed to the general public. So don't wear red pants. The second point that this red pants story conveys to me is always question your assumptions. Always question your assumptions. So here you have this assumption by these French conservatives who basically say it would be against the honor of France to change the red pants and the red and blue uniform. Why? The killer statement that comes up in business discussions, and I've heard it many, many times over the years, is, this is the way we've always done things. Well, yeah, but why? Why are we doing things this way? If your negotiation partner's position is, this is the way we've always done things, don't accept that. Never accept that statement. Show your negotiating partner that, okay, you've always done things that way in the past, but doing things now that way is really stupid. And if you can help show them that fact, then maybe you can change the situation to your benefit. But the 2 points I want to leave you with on the red pants scenario are, again, hold back facts until you really need them, or at least consider doing that, and always question your assumptions. Now, I want to go to another story in the book, and this appears later in the book. And The second rule that I want to convey to you, and I've talked about this in the past, is never forget the value of face-to-face meetings. We live in a business world now where obviously it's expensive to travel. We do lots of stuff by telephone and by Zoom and Teams and all these other apps. But sometimes there's just no substitute for getting on an airplane or getting in a car and going to meet your negotiating partner face-to-face. You can many times develop a better personal relationship that way, and you can read signals better because you're in their office, you see the way they interact with their coworkers. You may see things in the office that give you an indication about the way they operate. Sometimes there's just no substitute for that. And I want to take you to a meeting that happens at the beginning of September 1914 as the war has broken out. And the situation is this. After some initial successes, the French army has been pushed back by the German army and is being chased across Europe. And they are in full retreat. And the way this happened is the Germans did not attack directly as a direct frontal attack on the line of the French army. The German military doctrine for a long time, formulated by a German general called von Schlieffen, rested on the proposition that they would not attack directly, but they would make a wide sweep around France, through Belgium, come down next to the English Channel, and then attack France and the French army from the rear, basically enveloping the French army. And they engaged in this flanking maneuver. There were several vicious battles fought, but eventually the Germans succeed in rolling up the French flanks and start chasing the French army toward Paris. The French army is trying to fall back to form a defensive position. It's not a good situation. It looks like the war is going to end very quickly and that the Germans are going to conquer France again, which they had done in 1870, which, by the way, is something that still sticks in the French craw as of the time this war breaks out, was the fact that the Germans defeated them in 1870 and then insisted on very onerous surrender terms, including turning over the valuable region of Alsace-Lorraine. Enter into this mix the fact that the British Expeditionary Force, a large chunk of the British Army, is in France ostensibly to help the French, but they are led by a field marshal named John French, and neither Field Marshal French nor any other British officer really wants to get involved headlong in this war at this moment, because it looks like the war is definitely going against France and the Allies. And if the French are conquered and the Germans take over France, the British feel like they're next, and they can't afford to lose their army in battles that can't be won. So the British are also falling back and are reluctant to get involved in the war. But here's what happens. Instead of going directly into Paris, the Germans are intent on destroying a large segment of the French army. So they make a turn away from Paris to chase that chunk of the French army to try to destroy it. When they do that, the French officers in Paris, principally Joseph Joffre, who is a French general and the commander-in-chief of the French army, realize that the Germans, in chasing that other portion of the French army, have just presented their flank to the remaining portion of the French army outside of Paris, and that if the French army immediately counterattacks, they can turn the tables by rolling up the flank of the Germans and defeating them outside Paris. But they need to act quickly, and they need British help. And the British, as I said, are very reluctant to get involved in this battle at first, and they are involved in retreating. So what does Joffre do? He realizes telephones and telegraphs are not going to solve this problem. I need to go see John French. And I want to pick up the book at this point, The Guns of August, and read this little snippet about the meeting that happens between Joffre and John French. I'm going to throw some names at you in this passage. The first name you're going to hear is Alexandre Millerand, who is the French Minister of War at the time. To the book. On the morning of September 5th, Joffre's uncertainty about British intentions became altogether agonizing. He begged Millerand by telegram to exert the government's influence. The imminent battle can have decisive results, but in case of a reverse can also have the gravest consequences for the country, Joffre said. I count on you to call the field marshal's attention to the decisive importance of an offensive. If I could give orders to the English army as I could to the French army in the same position, I would pass immediately to the attack, period, close quote. And there's part of the problem that the French face at this moment, which is that they have an ally in the field, the British Army, but they don't have the authority to issue orders to the army and expect that the British Army will follow them. The British Army is operating as an independent force. And by the way, later in the war in 1917, when the Americans come over, they too want to operate as an independent force separate from Central Command. It creates all kinds of miscommunications and difficulties, but General John Pershing, who was the head of the American Expeditionary Force, did not want his troops to be under the commands of foreign officers, and that became an issue. And you know, if you study history, that the Allies learned from their lesson from this, because in the Second World War, they appointed Dwight Eisenhower as the chief of all armies in the field in Europe, so that he was able to direct the British and French and the American allies to follow orders. And that was extremely important in cutting down these miscommunications and this resistance to a central command. What's the lesson from that? Well, on a negotiation team or in any negotiation, you have to have somebody who's making decisions. You can't have a team operating independently and talking to people on the other side, because you need to have message discipline. So number one thing when you're putting a negotiation team together is who's dealing with the other side, who has the ability to make final decisions. And you should learn that about the other side too. Figure out who's the real decision maker on the other side. We often in sales or in business think about that, but it really is important. You don't want to be talking deals with people who are not in the position to make real decisions. Now you're going to hear about Henry Wilson. I'm going to mention the name Henry Wilson. He's the senior British staff officer on John French's staff, and you're going to see that Joffre goes to talk to the French, and here's how it goes. Back to the book. At 3 o'clock that morning, Henry Wilson received order number 6 from Huguet. General Huguet is the French liaison officer to the British Expeditionary Force, and I should mention what order number 6 is. Order number 6 is a French order to the British Expeditionary Force to participate in the counteroffensive against the German army outside of Paris. Now, it's an order, but it's unenforceable because the British are not in the chain of command of the French army at this point. But the order is issued, and here's how it goes. Let me go back to the book and start that passage again. At 3 o'clock that morning, Henry Wilson received order number 6 from Huguet, who, however, did not permit Captain de Galbert, the officer who brought it, to see any of the British chiefs. Let me stop there. So we have an order from the French commanding the British to get involved in this counteroffensive. But Joffre is smart, and his staff are smart enough that they want to keep this under wraps. They don't want other British officers to see this order because they don't want anyone to get the idea that they are disrespecting the British and essentially calling them cowards. They want to keep this, addressed only to the eyes of the people who need to see it, namely John French. So that's something to keep in mind in a negotiation. You don't have to share all of the information with everyone. The question is, who's entitled to see this information, and is there information that we don't want everyone to see? Joffre clearly realized that this information, this order number 6, should only go to the people who needed to see it. Back to the book. At the center of every discord during this period, with a curiously malign consistency, the figure of Huguet appears. Deciding that the situation required someone of higher rank, Captain de Galbert started back at once for French headquarters. At 7 a.m., Wilson took the order to Sir John French and during the course of the morning persuaded him to cooperate. Meanwhile, de Galbert arrived back at French headquarters at 9:30 with no definite news, but with a report that British sentiment seemed lukewarm toward an offensive. The mayor of Melun, that is where Melun is the town where John French's headquarters are at the time. The mayor of Melun had told him Sir John French's baggage was being moved back to Fontainebleau. Now, that's not good because that indicates that French is intent on continuing the retreat. He's moving his stuff to the rear. Back to the book. Joffre felt that he must have the British army in the battle line at any price, even at the price of motoring 115 miles to Melun. Sending a telephone message ahead to expect him, he set out with his aide and 2 staff officers. Despite roadblocks and the ineluctable stop for lunch, his racing chauffeur brought him to the chateau where Sir John French was quartered by 2 p.m. Let me step away from the book. I find this funny because we have this pivotal decision to save France. Time is of the essence. And Joffre realizes that time is of the essence, but in true French style, he decides to stop and have lunch. It kind of reminded me of, I had an uncle who fought in Europe during the Second World War. He was stationed in Italy. He was with the Army Air Corps. And it drove him nuts when they were trying to run missions and his British partners would sit down in the middle of what they were trying to do and have tea. Whatever tea time was supposed to be, it was inviolate. It drove him crazy. He used to talk about it all the time when I was a kid. I thought it was so funny. But listen, let's not get in the way of tea. Got to have a little tea to keep things moving. And this is something to keep in mind in negotiation. People may have quirks. They may have societal customs, depending on who you're dealing with. And you just have to roll with it. You can't tell them, no, don't do that, because it could be deemed offensive. So there you go. So Joffre stops for lunch, but then he gets back in his car. And now he gets to John French's headquarters at 2 p.m. Back to the book. The field marshal was standing at a table waiting for him, flanked by Murray, Wilson, Huguet, looking as usual as if he had lost his last friend, and several other members of his staff. Joffre walked over and for once took the floor at the outset. Instead of his usual laconic sentences, a passionate flood of speech poured forth, punctuated by a gesture of his forearms which seemed to throw his heart on the table. He said the supreme moment had arrived. His own orders were given, and whatever happened, the last company of the French army would be thrown into the battle to save France. The lives of all French people, the soil of France, the future of Europe depended upon this offensive. Quote, I cannot believe the British army will refuse to do its share in this supreme crisis. History would severely judge your absence. Joffre's fist crashed down on the table. Monsieur le Maréchal, the honor of England is at stake. At these words, Sir John French, who had been listening with passionate attention, suddenly reddened. Silence fell on the company. Slowly, tears came into the eyes of the British commander-in-chief and rolled down his cheeks. He struggled to say something in French and gave up. Damn it, I can't explain. Tell him we will do all we possibly can. Joffre looked inquiringly at Wilson, who translated. The field marshal says yes. It was hardly needed, for the tears and the tone already carried conviction. Murray hurriedly put in that the British troops were now 10 miles farther back than the positions called for in Order Number 6 and could only start at 9 a.m., not 6 a.m. as Joffre asked. It was a voice of caution that would continue to make itself felt. Joffre shrugged. It cannot be helped. I have the field marshal's word, and that is enough. Tea was then served. It's an amazing story. Now, what do we take from this? Well, first of all, I'll say it again, never forget the value of face-to-face meetings. To be able to go there face-to-face and say these things to Sir John French carried the day. He could see Joffre's conviction, and Joffre could see the need to steel up French, to get him to start moving. And the only way to do that was to go there and be passionate. You know, warrior energy is very useful. Sometimes when you're in a meeting and it's stuck and you just passionately express that it's time to move forward, it can have an effect. I remember when I started my law firm in 1995, and I had a great partner, still friendly with him. He left the firm after 15 years to pursue other interests, but we had a great partnership for a long time, 15 years. And we had hired a lawyer to draft up our corporate documents when we started the firm. And I had never started a firm before. My parents had tried to start a business when I was in high school, but it failed. I got the documents. I read them several times. They were basic corporate formation documents, but I was clearly dragging my heels a little bit because this was a big jump for me. And at one point, this lawyer that we hired looked at me and said, "Gene, it's time to move forward." And you know what? He was right. And I signed the documents. But sometimes in a face-to-face meeting, you got to express that warrior energy. It's time to move forward. The other thing that I think is notable about this meeting between Joffre and Sir John French is that Joffre basically asked him, "What's going to happen if you don't help us? Can you imagine the embarrassment on the world stage that will come from the fact that you had a chance to help us and save Europe and you ran away?" Now, he said it a little nicer than that, but that's the implication. And that leads to a key question that often can be asked in negotiation, which I think people forget to ask a lot of times. You look at your negotiating partner and you say, "What will happen if you don't do this deal?" And you help your negotiating partner recognize the downsides and the problems that would happen if they don't take the opportunity you're presenting. I mean, that's what Joffre held to John French. He said, "What's going to happen if you don't do this deal, if you don't follow this order?" And it had an effect on Sir John French. So the British did participate in the counterattack. And this was known as the Battle of the Marne that took place in September 1914. The German attack in France was stopped. The Germans were driven back. And what resulted then was both sides getting into their trenches and slugging it out in horrible trench-to-trench warfare for 4 years. But the bottom line is, in this instance, they did stop the advance of the German troops, and they did manage to save Paris. The Germans did not enter Paris. So never forget the value of face-to-face meetings. And the third rule, and the last one I want to talk to you about from the Guns of August, and by the way, get the book. Really, get this book. I'm only very, very barely scratching the surface. The personalities involved are amazing. And to really understand 20th century history and how we got here to where we are now, you really need to understand the First World War and what led up to it. And these personalities are just amazing in this book. Really worth your time. It's not that long of a book, but it's technical. Like I say, after about the first third, you really start to get into the chess match between the armies, which is fascinating. But it's going to require some concentration. It's not a light read. But I want to go back to the third rule. The third rule is don't bore people. Don't be boring. And how are you boring? You're boring when you're not prepared. So when you're in a meeting or a negotiation with someone, you can tell when the other side's not prepared. And it's a little disrespectful. They're wasting your time. And because they don't know the issues cold, it's boring. You're there ready to have a meaningful discussion, and the other side isn't ready for that. It's just not fun. So don't put yourself in that position. And for this portion of my little 3-rule presentation, I'm going to move away from the war itself and talk about the writer, Barbara Tuchman. She was an amazing writer and an amazing historian. And I want to go not to the actual book itself, but, well, not to the substance of the book, but to the preface of the book, which was written by another historian named Robert Massey. And Robert Massey really got into how Barbara Tuchman wrote her books and what admiration he had for her. And I just want to read a little bit to you from the preface or the foreword to the book written by Robert Massey. And here's what he writes. She began with research, that is, by accumulating facts. She had read widely all her life, but her purpose now was to immerse herself in this time and these events, to put herself at the elbow of the people whose lives she was describing. She read letters, telegrams, diaries, memoirs, cabinet documents, battle orders, secret codes, and love letters. She inhabited libraries, the New York Public Library, the Library of Congress, the National Archives, the British Library and Public Record Office, the Bibliothèque Nationale, the Sterling Library at Yale, and the Widener Library at Harvard. As a student, she recalled the stacks at the Widener had been my Archimedes bathtub, my burning bush, my dish of mold where I found my personal penicillin. I was blissful as a cow, put to graze in a field of fresh clover and would not have cared if I had been locked in for the night. You know, it's funny she says this because where I went to school at the University of Chicago, they had this big library called the Regenstein Library. And sometimes when I got a little overwhelmed by work, I would just go prowl the stacks looking for interesting books. So I get exactly what she's saying here. Back to the book. One summer before writing The Guns of August, she rented a small Renault and toured the battlefields of Belgium and France. I saw the fields ripe with grain which the cavalry would have trampled, measured the great width of the Meuse at Liège, and saw how the lost territory of Alsace looked to the French soldiers who gazed down upon it from the heights of the Vosges. In libraries, on battlefields, at her desk, her quarry was always the vivid specific fact which would imprint on the reader's mind the essential nature of the man or event. The larger purpose in Barbara Tuchman's research was to find out simply what really happened, and as best she could, how it actually felt for the people present. She recommended letting the facts lead the way. To find out what happened in history is enough at the outset, she said, without trying too soon to make sure of the why. I believe it is safer to leave the why alone until one has not only gathered the facts but arranged them in sequence, to be exact in sentences, paragraphs, and chapters. The very process of transforming a collection of personalities, dates, gun calibers, letters, and speeches into a narrative eventually forces the why to the surface. The problem with research, of course, was knowing when to stop. One must stop before one has finished, she advised. Otherwise, one will never stop and never finish. The writing process, she said, was laborious, slow, often painful, sometimes agony. It requires rearrangement, revision, adding, cutting, rewriting. But it brings a sense of excitement, almost a rapture, a moment on Olympus. Precisely controlled, elegant language, she felt, was the instrument to give voice to history. Her ultimate objective was to make the reader turn the page. In a time of mass culture egalitarianism and mediocrity, she was an elitist. For her, the two essential criteria of quality were intensive effort and honesty of purpose. The difference is not only a matter of artistic skill, but of intent. You either do it well, or you do it half well, she said. Wow. I often talk about how important it is to be prepared for a negotiation. I don't mean just knowing the facts. Everybody knows the facts if you have any competence in a negotiation. I mean living the facts. I mean going to the places where things happen. I mean researching independent sources to verify facts and to get ideas. I mean doing what Barbara Tuchman talked about doing. So let me ask you, when you're preparing for a complex negotiation, Do you do these things? Do you try to gather the facts? Do you go to the places where things happen? Do you read letters, diaries, emails, memoirs, codes, anything you can get your hands on? You don't even have to go to the New York Public Library or the Library of Congress. It's at your fingertips these days. And I often say, I tell young lawyers and young negotiators, you should plan to spend 4 hours preparing for every hour you spend at the negotiating table. But of course, to go to her point, you have to stop before you're finished. Otherwise, you'll never stop. You can keep researching and keep researching and keep researching. But at some point, it becomes a curve of diminishing return. Sometimes you just have to sit, put your feet up, and look out the window and let things percolate. If you ask people, where do you get your best ideas? A lot of times they'll say, in the shower, when I'm showering in the morning. Because your mind is free and it starts to become creative. And that's what she's talking about. And that's what I'm talking about to you. She also says, gather the facts and the why will take care of itself. So make sure you have all the facts cold. Make sure you can argue the other side's position better than they can. Once you get the facts together, the why takes care of itself. You often want the other side to come to conclusions and think it was their idea. And if you present them with facts that lead inexorably to the conclusion you want to reach, except they reach it without you forcing it down their throats, well, that's the best kind of persuasion you can have. It's an amazing book. She was an amazing writer and an amazing person. And I really, really can't highly enough recommend this book, The Guns of August. So if you get a chance, if you have some time and space on your reading list, please insert this one. You won't be sorry. And she was a voracious reader. And you know how we say all leaders are readers. The more you can read about things like this, the more you can read about human nature and decisions that are made under stress, even if it looks like a type of situation that's not directly analogous to what you're dealing with, the better negotiator you will be. And that's what we're trying to do here, make you a better negotiator and also make me a better negotiator, or at least a better student of negotiation. And folks, that's all I have for you today on the Station for Negotiation. So this is Gene Killian once again signing off and reminding you that negotiation is life. Hey, thanks for listening to the Station for Negotiation podcast. Until next time, you can keep up with us on social media at the following places. On X, formerly known as Twitter, it's at STN4Negotiation. That's at STN4Negotiation. On Facebook, you can hit us up at facebook.com/Station4Negotiation pod. That's facebook.com/Station4Negotiation pod. Over on Instagram, you can reach us at Station4Negotiation. Again, that's at Station4Negotiation. On LinkedIn, Station4Negotiation podcast. Again, that's Station4Negotiation podcast. Over on YouTube, we're at Station4Negotiation. That's at Station4Negotiation. If you want to shoot us an email, you can do that at Station4Negotiationpod@gmail.com. That's Station4Negotiationpod@gmail.com. So we'll see you next time on the Station for Negotiation podcast. And until then, remember, negotiation is life.